Well, here we are, everybody. We have reached the end of yet another year, and I'm sure a lot of people are happy to see this year come to an end. I don't want to end this year on a bad note, so I'm gonna start with the worst movies of this year. But before we get into my list of the worst movies of 2020, that is exactly what this list is. This is my list. This is my opinion. You guys may disagree with me, and that is perfectly okay, and I already know some people who watch this video will absolutely disagree with me because, to my knowledge, some movies on this list were pretty well received by audiences and critics. So without further ado, let's get right into it. These movies sucked. These are the worst movies of 2020. And let's get started at the bottom at number 10, and that spot goes to Like Zoink Scoob! We're in the worst movies of 2020! Ruh-roh, Raggy! Scoob is a movie that you can tell is not geared towards old fans of the original shows. It's more geared towards millennials with its overabundance of pop culture references and its over-reliance on being a superhero movie rather than a Scooby-Doo movie. I mean, seriously, Scooby himself seems more like an afterthought. It's like the writers wrote up the script and they just added Scooby-Doo as an afterthought because it would have been more marketable that way. The character models look very nice, but the backgrounds look like not nearly as much detail went into them. You could tell most of the budget went into the character models themselves, and I mean, that's fine, but at least put a little bit more work into the backgrounds. But the cardinal sin of Scoob is that it completely failed to capture what made the original cartoon great. And that's a really sad thing to consider when you take into account that this movie had 4 writers. I know this is one of those movies that a lot of people liked, but I didn't like it. I thought it was rather bad. I mean, obviously, it's on my worst of the year list. So, let's move on to number 9. And holding that 9th spot is a melodramatic film that's only goal in mind is nothing more than to capitalize on the times that we are living in. Songbird. Songbird is about the COVID-23 virus and how the government has basically become totalitarian. Even though it is so on the nose, that idea could have worked if the execution was done correctly. Instead of telling a story about how the virus has changed the world, it chooses to focus on an extremely sappy love story between these two characters who you could not give a shit about. And it's harder to take seriously when you take into account that the two main characters have never met in person. And there's a multitude of other characters who have no real purpose in the story. I mean, if you just took them out entirely, nothing would have changed. For example, there's this disabled military vet who simps over this streamer, and he sends her money all the time. And there's like a side story between the two of them starting to fall in love with each other, I guess, but it's not developed at all, and if neither of these characters were present, nothing would have changed in the main story. This movie was written, shot, and edited during the pandemic. It was shot, I think, in like July and August. And you could tell that the filmmakers really rushed this thing out without putting much thought into it because they just wanted to be the first pandemic movie released. And I'll give them credit because they succeeded at being the first pandemic movie released, but they did not succeed at making a good film. Taking the 8th spot is Disney's latest attempt to destroy one of their most famous properties, Mulan. This is 2 years in a row now that a Disney live-action remake has made my worst of the year list. Not good, Disney. Not good. And I know that this is just my opinion because this is yet another film that a lot of people seem to like for some reason. And that's fine, more power to you, but for me, this movie absolutely destroyed everything that made the original animated film so great. It takes everything that was so special about the original and just spits in its face. There's no Mushu, there's no songs like I'll Make a Man Out of You, and there is certainly no memorable characters like her 3 friends that she meets at the army camp. Now, I can't be too critical because that's something I applaud Disney for when it came to making Mulan. That was one of my main criticisms of The Lion King last year. It didn't try anything new, it just cut and pasted the exact same movie. I respect that they took some of the main aspects of the original film out in order to make something new out of it, but the things that they took out is what made the original so great in the first place. So what do you get as a result of this? You get another really generic kung fu movie with absolutely no redeeming qualities. Oh boy, am I excited to talk about this one. At number 7, we have a movie that I did not expect to hate nearly as much as I did. Birds of Prey, or the fantabulous emancipation of one Harley Quinn. Just to give you an idea of how much I did not like this movie, it's not even 2 hours long, and I'm not kidding you when I tell you that it took me maybe 4 or 5 hours to watch it. I was so bored and uninterested in this film, I kept pausing it and just played on my phone. I found so much more entertainment in that. This film contains one of the most obnoxious story structures I think I've ever seen. It tries way too hard to be like movies like Pulp Fiction, and it tells the events out of order. It just does not work for a comic book movie like this. Like, there's a scene where Harley goes into a police station and she starts attacking everybody and shooting up the place, and then it pauses and you hear a voiceover from Harley saying, "Oh, we're not supposed to be at this part yet. Let me take you back a little bit so I can show you how we got here." No, Harley, that is not what I want. I would rather this movie be told in chronological order. But it does this so often with the incessant voiceovers and flashbacks. It's just so disorienting. And besides Harley herself, none of the characters are particularly memorable. I mean, Ewan McGregor is in this movie as Black Mask, who is the main antagonist. Now, I love Ewan McGregor, I really do. He's a great actor. I mean, he's Obi-Wan, for God's sake. But in this movie, he is just so miscast. I mean, he does well for what he's given, but he just does not fit this character at all. Now, here's a hot take for you. I am willing to go out on a limb and say this is easily the worst DC Extended Universe movie. Yes, I liked Suicide Squad and Batman vs. Superman a hell of a lot more than this. Taking our 6th spot is the most unfunny comedy of 2020, Coffee and Cream. This movie isn't funny because the humor basically just boils down to LOL, children cursing. There's an overabundance of jokes that usually involve sex or race relations. It feels like the humor is trying way too hard to be edgy while simultaneously trying to make a statement about what it's joking about, but it completely fails at both of them. It also tries way too hard to be absurd and action-y. I mean, there's a lot of slow motion shootouts, and they use slow motion so much to the point where it just becomes annoying. And it also doesn't help that our title characters, Coffee and Kareem, are probably the worst on-screen duo I've ever seen. Ed Helms basically just plays the exact same character in everything that he's in. I mentioned in my review of this movie that he's basically just Andy Bernard as a cop. And Kareem, I don't even remember the actor's name, but the kid who plays Kareem, I mean, he's fine. I'm sure he's a very nice young man, but the character of Kareem is one of the most infuriating characters I've seen in any movie. Is it wrong that I personally did not care if this kid lived or died in this movie? Like, am I wrong for thinking that? Because I feel like a lot of people agree with me. We have now reached the top 5, and taking that 5th spot is Bloodshot. Vin Diesel is at it again, where he plays an action hero in a completely forgettable film. Bloodshot truly is one of the most predictable comic book movies I've ever seen. I mean, right from the start, Vin Diesel's character is on some kind of mission where he succeeds and he comes home to his wife, and then we get this obnoxiously long montage where they go on vacation and there's these really generic B-roll shots of them kissing and just being happy together. And right then and there, I'm like, well, his wife is clearly going to die, and that's gonna be the driving force throughout the entire movie. And sure enough, I was right. I mean, there is more to it because Vin Diesel's character is killed and he's brought back to life by this company, and they just use him to kill their enemies, but they use the memory of his wife being killed by different people, so he kills the people that the company wants dead. I don't know. I haven't seen this movie in forever. I watched it once, like 9 months ago. It also doesn't help that Bloodshot has some of the most abysmal CGI I've ever seen. I mean, seriously, the graphics in Cyberpunk 2077 are looking at this movie and thinking, wow, that's awful. See? I can stay current. The script was also just awful because the motivations and relationships between the characters were so underdeveloped. And then there was a point toward the third act where I honestly had no idea what was happening. This movie is too dumb to get unnecessarily convoluted like that. Like, who do you think you are? This movie also reassured a thought that I've had for a few years now, and that is, Vin Diesel is just not a good actor. I'm sorry, he's not. Have you ever seen a movie that he's in and thought, wow, Vin Diesel was great in that? Because I don't think I have. And moving on to number 4 is a horror reimagining of a classic 70s television show, Fantasy Island. What could go wrong when you're trying to reboot a classic television show that's almost 50 years old as horror? Well, in this case, just about everything. A movie about an island where people go to live out their biggest fantasies with a horror twist, and you get this hunk of shit. Chock full of some of the most cringiest dialogue and ridiculously cartoonish characters, and some of these fantasies that these characters have are incredibly basic. There is literally a character whose fantasy is to join the military. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to join the military, more power to you, because I have great respect for our troops overseas who are fighting for this country. But you're telling me that if someone walked up to you and asked you what your deepest, darkest, most personal fantasy was, you would tell them it was to join the military? Really? And there's another character whose fantasy is to get back at her childhood bully, and that just seems so cliched. We follow like 5 or 6 different characters throughout the movie, and each one of them is living in their own fantasy, but they're all so wildly different from one another that it makes the tone so uneven. There's these 2 brothers who are having like a rager in a mansion. Lucy Hale is escaping with her childhood bully, and this soldier character, he's like in the middle of war, and you have another character who's played by Maggie Q, and she's just lounging on a beach with her husband and daughter because that's what her fantasy consisted of. It just feels like the stakes are not nearly as high for all of them. And this movie also contains one of the dumbest plot twists ever, and that's saying something considering my next entry, but we'll get to that in a second. This movie came out in February, so I'm just going to tell you what the twist is, and I'll consider it me doing you a favor. So it turns out Lucy Hale is the person who brought all the people to the island because she wanted to get revenge on them. And why does she want revenge on them? Did they wrong her in some way? I mean, she wanted revenge on her childhood bully, so did they bully her too? No. She wants revenge on these people because they were all connected to a boy who died in a fire. And this boy who died in a fire was supposed to take Lucy Hale's character out on a date, but he never showed up because he died in a fire. And all the other characters on the island were somehow connected to this. I mean, I understand you may be a little devastated, but doesn't that seem a little extreme? You want to kill these people because one person showed you attention and you're that insecure? Oh god, this movie was such a fucking headache. And the number 3 spot, we have Antebellum. Pretty much sums up how I felt while I was watching this film. This movie takes place on a slave plantation. It's run by Confederate soldiers, and for the first hour, I had absolutely no idea where this movie was going because absolutely nothing is explained and nothing happens. Now, I said previously that this movie also contains a really stupid twist. And the twist is that this slave plantation that these people are working on is modern day. And I feel like that twist probably would have hit a little harder if it was explained better. Like, why was this plantation created? And why was Janelle Monáe chosen to serve there? How did they choose any of the people they have to serve there? And better yet, how the hell did they get away with creating a slave plantation and kidnapping random people and their loved ones and the police never found them? It doesn't make any sense. And that twist has also been done before. That is the exact same twist in M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. It's a society that's cut off from the rest of the world, and it's revealed that it takes place in modern day. Granted, it is a little bit different because the people in The Village didn't know they were living in modern day, but still, it's been done before. And the entire time I was watching, it felt like they were just trying to copy a Jordan Peele movie. And it also feels like this movie was trying way too hard to make a point than tell a story. But if you saw my worst of the year list from last year, you'll know that I included a movie called Serenity on that list. And I included Serenity on that list because that movie took itself way too seriously. It thought it was a lot smarter than it actually was, and it contained a really stupid plot twist. Does that sound familiar? Antebellum is 2020's Serenity. We are now at the top two. The runner-up for the worst movie of 2020 belongs to The Last Days of American Crime. I honestly don't know what to say about this movie because I wasn't really paying that close of attention to it, but all the spots where I was actually watching were atrocious. This movie is 2.5 hours long. It had no business being that long. I'm surprised I even finished it, to tell you the truth. Granted, it did take me all day to finish it because I think I started watching this movie at like noon on a Saturday and I didn't finish it till about 10. This movie is based off a critically acclaimed graphic novel where the government is going to send out this radio signal that will stop people from willingly committing violent acts and crime. And that is a really good idea that I feel could have translated well into a film, but when your director is Olivier Megaton, whose previous masterpieces include Taken 2 and Taken 3, then you're not gonna get a good end result. But basically the entire gist of this thing is that these three people want to commit like the crime of the century before the signal comes out. So they want to rob a bank with millions of dollars, and this bank robbery heist is so anticlimactic. There was absolutely no planning, no build-up to it, and the heist came off rather easy. They literally just walk into the bank and they blow the safe open. I'm not kidding, that's what happens. But I'll tell you what, there is one scene in particular in this film where a character by the name of Kevin Cash goes and confronts his father, and this is one of the funniest sequences I've ever seen in any movie. The writing is so terrible, the acting is abysmal, and just the camera placements are baffling. There is a line that is spoken by the character's father, which is literally, and I quote, "What kind of sicko fucks his stepmother?" He delivered it a lot more angrily and louder, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. But if it wasn't for that scene, this movie may have been at number 1. But here we are, we have reached the top spot, the worst movie of 2020. And if you watch my channel, this should not come as a surprise to you. The Turning. This is the first movie I've ever reviewed that I have given a 0 out of 10 score to. There is absolutely nothing redeeming about this movie. I made a joke in my review that they should have called The Turning Horror Cliches the movie, because that's literally all it is. There's scenes where a camera will move away from someone, and then it'll pan back to them, and something will be behind them. There's that age-old cliche where someone is looking in a mirror, they open it and nothing is there, they close it, something is there, and other things appear in reflections like windows. And there are so many dream sequences. There's even a scene that's a dream sequence within a dream sequence. The editing is absolute garbage. It has no sense of the passage of time whatsoever. And there's these random fades to these inserts, and then it'll just fade back to what we were already being shown. It comes off like the filmmakers just like how that shot looked, so they were like, we have to use that, where should we put it? The acting is really bad, but especially by Finn Wolfhard. Now, I like Finn Wolfhard. I think he does a really good job in Stranger Things, but I'm sorry, he was just so bad in this. I mean, he does his best with what he's given, but his character is just so awful and horribly written. They try to make him come off like this really mysterious kid, but he just comes off like a weirdo. But easily the worst thing about The Turning is its ending. It's almost as if the filmmakers legitimately had no idea how to end this movie, so they just picked a random place and like, right there, that's where we're gonna end it. I mean, seriously, this movie just ends with a cut to black and then credits start rolling. But I'll tell you one thing that made it worthwhile. The audience reaction in my theater when this movie ended is one of the greatest things I've ever witnessed. Everyone was so taken aback by the way this movie ended that there was audible disgust throughout the entire thing. I heard people cursing, I heard people screaming, I heard audible gasps and what? And then I was walking out, people just kept talking more shit about it, saying that was awful, that was so stupid, it didn't make any sense, and all of those statements are 100% true. And it's for that reason why The Turning holds my top spot for the worst movie of 2020. Well, that's it, everybody. That is my list for the worst movies of 2020. If you guys saw any of these movies, let me know what you thought about them, and comment your lists down below. I would love to see them. Did you agree with my placements, or did you disagree with them? If you guys like this video, then be sure to hit that thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe. If you guys want to see my video discussing the worst movies of 2019, I will link that right over here. Other than that, I hope you all have a tremendous day, and I will see you all next time where I discuss the best movies of 2020.